Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel on AI and civil society. We have 90 minutes together. My name is Kloiber. I will be moderating these 90 minutes, and we have a stellar lineup of panelists here on the stage. Just to give you a quick teaser, we'll be hearing about feminist data sets, killer robots, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and remote and unconnected parts of this world. To kick us off and to get to know the panelists a little bit better and the projects that they're working on, I asked everyone here on stage to give us a short input talk and to tell us how they are trying to change and challenge the status quo with the work that they are doing. And after the inputs, we're going to dig a little deeper. We are going to unpack today's topic. The title of this session is How AI Infrastructures Can Advance the Public Good. And last but not least, we'll invite all of you here at Ars Electronica, but also online, to join us and to ask questions to the panelists and to join the discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first panelist. Her name is Caroline Sinders. Hi, Caroline. She's a critical designer and artist. And for the past few years, she's been examining the intersections of artificial intelligence, intersectional justice, and politics in digital spaces and technology platforms. The list of organizations that you've been working with is long. Among them are the United Nations and Wikimedia. She's also a fellow at the Ars Electronica AI Lab. You can see her art project, the art project that she's doing together with Anna Riddler outside. It's called Cypress Trees and Beginning. And yeah, Caroline, why don't you tell us about the feminist data set and projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm an artist and researcher, and I look at the built world, particularly through the lens of design. So how design presents an opportunity for people to understand or misunderstand technology around them. Design can be this sort of obfuscating force at times, as well as an explanatory force. Feminist Data Set is a critical design project. Critical design is a sort of methodology and theory championed by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby when they were at the Royal College of Art. So critical design asks that we look at design through a non-capitalist lens. What is design if we remove capitalism from the equation? And I think it offers an opportunity to actually really explore. So by saying that, Feminist Data Set is using intersectional feminism as an investigatory framework for looking at the AI pipeline by making a chatbot, but also sort of building a machine learning system and algorithm, but again, through critical design. Pedagogically, it's inspired by a critical design project called the Toaster Project by Thomas Twaits, in which he builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from digging up his own iron ore out of the ground to making his own plastic. And when I say pedagogically, this inspires the feminist data set. The toaster is quite misshapen, so the actual art project I'm making, metaphorically, software-wise, the model will be extraordinarily misshapen. And I'm interested in failure in spaces of exploration. So what happens if you truly try to build something from an intersectional feminist standpoint with technology? What are the failures or concessions you have to make when making? For example, I'm using Apple hardware. I can't make my own laptop right now, right? So that is a concession I have to make. But I'm also interested in how you would break this down into very tiny sections and then remake a process through intersectional feminism. So how do we gather data in a feminist way? What does it look like? What are the procedures for that? How do you train or label or clean that data? What is the feminist way to do that? So what is a feminist way to gather people together to clean a data set? Should it be one person? Is even the act, like the mundane and time-consuming act of structuring and cleaning and labeling data, could that ever be feminist? And then moving into what are the tools you would use and why and how will you use them and how will they need to be remade or augmented? And then what are the concessions that are made within that to then finally make this outcome? So I'm really interested in that, and this is why I call it a critical design project, because it won't be commercially viable, it won't be even probably commercially useful. But again, what can we learn by giving ourselves this constraint?
Yeah, I took a look at the Feminist Dataset website and also the toolkit, and I think there you talk about, is it useful art?
Yes,
yeah,
arte utile. That's a theory created by Tanya Bruguera. So it goes even beyond critical design and speculative design by saying, well, what is art if it's rooted in usefulness? And I think that's kind of the opposite of how we think about art, at least. So I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in photography, and then I have a master's in interactive technology. So art is often, it's not supposed to be didactic or polemic. It's supposed to be ambiguous. It's supposed to be poetic in a way. And so usefulness is the exact opposite we could think of ambiguity. Usefulness can often be very small, very direct, very specific, right? For something to be useful, it has to be used. And art can be transformative and create new imaginaries, but when you apply usefulness to it, I think you hit a very specific kind of very small intersection, and that's the intersection I find really interesting.
And when we read about AI these days, like we come across words such as transparency, feminism is one of them, right? And ethics, so there seems to be progress in the field, or do you feel that it's just buzzwords that are being thrown around? So what's your take on this?
Oh, it's totally buzzwords. I mean, this is something Karen Howe covered for the MIT Technology Review, which is there's like an ethics washing undergoing. And I see that even in times of other, we could say like so-called feminist tech projects, in a way that like feminism becomes a buzzword, or rather it's only a small part of the project. And I think it's important to sort of take a step back and say, well, what do you mean by transparency? What do you mean by feminism here? And assuming that feminism makes something more equitable, it may not, right? How were people paid, for example? How is it funded? Who was acknowledged or not acknowledged? What were the trade-offs that happen? Oftentimes we can't acknowledge those things. You know, if you're writing a paper, how do you also acknowledge the gaps of what was or wasn't there? Or who funded it? Sometimes it's like, this is what was only available. But I think it's important to sort of talk about all of these things. Does transparency make something more equitable or not? Does inherently open sourcing something make it better or worse? I think it's important to sort of talk about why you chose something, what does it mean, or what inherently makes your process more equitable, if not. And this is something I constantly tell my students. What is ethics to you? How would you break it down into parts and define it? And then what was your process behind that? What was your methodology? How can you show that?
Thanks. We're going to dig a little deeper into all of these topics just in a bit, but I'd like to introduce the next panelist to you, Kilian Kleinschmidt. Kilian is an international networker, development and migration expert with 30 years of experience in the field, in a range of countries, in a range of emergencies. He worked as a United Nations official, as an aid worker, a diplomat, and among many other things, he also worked as the director of the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan. Some of you might remember the name. It's one of the biggest, the second biggest refugee camps in the world. And Kilian is also a social entrepreneur. He's the founder of the startup and innovation and planning agency, which aims to connect the millions of poor and dispossessed with resources, but also with modern technologies. And he's based in Tunisia. That's also where he traveled to us from. And Kilian, would you like to give us a little bit more insights into what you're currently working on and doing?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, almost 35 years by now, I realized. Working with those populations, disconnected, dispossessed, those who are very far from this bubble we are in here right now. We are roughly 8 billion in the world, and I think probably 6 billion or so are not part of that bubble with connectivity, with nice presentations, spaces which are equipped with all the tech you can imagine, and so on and so forth. That's the world I come from, so I feel sometimes when I come to these events like an extraterrestrial. Now, I really, I live in Tunisia, I work in Tunisia, I've chosen this place, it's very near to Europe. Migration, I worked with the UN Refugee Agency for a long time. I worked in really basically all the crisis situations you can imagine. Worked in earthquakes and anything you can imagine where people suffer. But now Tunisia is for me also a place where we can do something about migration. It's one of the major migration departure points to Europe. Irregular migration, it's called Taraga. So we do my company, which is called IPA Switchboard, and I come to the switchboard function in a sec. We do work with those who are trying to get across the Mediterranean, who made it across, who get sent back, and who are sort of really trapped in between the European border crap policies and basically dysfunctional societies, where it's not about jobs, it's about feeling, being part of the world, being part of a modern world which they aim for. We have another, and so we have a big team working on that. Second project, which is very dear to me, I was there actually a few days ago, and that's why it feels so strange. We work in southern Tunisia, there where Star Wars was done, planet Tataouine, out of an abandoned Berber village called Duret. We have a house there with troglodyte caves, several hundred years old. The village, 3,000 caves. And that's where we want to prove that connectivity, connecting opportunities in disconnected or largely disconnected parts of the world can bring about change, can provoke change, can initiate change. It doesn't have to be, in fact, the aid or the charity modalities, but it's about bringing in and connecting those people who have an idea, who have something they can work with, who have wealth in a way, but can't exploit it because they don't know what exists. Technology, best practice, worst practice, and thinking about that all as, the globe being like a brain, and a brain grows and develops the more connections opening, the more synapses are taking place. But again, so that's something where we're bringing in co-creation labs. We work with universities. We invite you, all of you, to come and join us. I'm looking actually at Ars Electronica for a desert edition, because that's in the desert between the Libyan and the Algerian borders. Create Project Tataouine as our future. The future in the desert connected to climate change, the challenges of how to use our technologies in an intelligent way and capture it from the big tech companies. Take it to us.
I'm curious about internet infrastructure in the desert. So what internet infrastructure do you have there right now? Like how you going online?
You put in a Wi-Fi box in front of your cave and then it connects to 4G. But we're also looking into Starlink, which will put a satellite over Tunisia, I think, next year. We're looking into such things, but we're using Wi-Fi boxes, and then we have had workshops down there where we connected Dresden in Germany with the university in Dresden, with a university in Tunis, with the caves where we had people working there as well, and we worked on an architecture project. It's very doable.
Yeah, when I was thinking about migration and refugees and then AI, something immediately popped up, the use of surveillance technology like biometric systems, facial recognition, LiDAR drones. So testing these technologies at our border at the most vulnerable populations. Is that something you've come across in your work?
Well, I have initiated a lot of this. I'm a culprit, if you want, because I really think, again, using such technologies for the better of people is also possible. You have to weigh between the Big Brother thing and somebody's watching you and the real benefits for people. In Al-Zatari refugee camp, we were feeding every day 130,000 people until we did a biometric registration, and then we discovered there were 30,000 people not there. So we reduced by 30,000 the stuff we were going out, so we were reducing the income of criminal networks who were pretending that the people were there. Secondly, we then changed from charity distributions where people receive stuff they don't want. We moved into smart cards, and people, excuse me, it sounds very capitalist, but it's like that, went from aid recipients, passive aid recipients, into active shoppers, happy shoppers. You should have seen the faces of the Syrians going into a supermarket, and instead of somebody handing them out something which they sell 2 minutes later in order to buy what they really want, having them being able and enabled to buy something in a supermarket with a caddy. It sounds silly, but it's a very, very major change for people. Yes, of course, control is one of the facts. In 2007, we registered, and it's now, of course, part of the news in a way. We registered in Pakistan 1.5 million Afghan refugees with biometrics. We worked on repatriation and return projects with iris verification. And there's a funny story of a woman who said, finally, that you have introduced this iris verification, I don't have to repatriate once every week to get the benefits. Now I'm repatriating only once. I mean, there's many, many little anecdotes and stories about this. But how to use that, I can expand on flood response in 2010 when 10 million people needed assistance and 1.5 million smart cards were issued.
I'm sure that there's many questions about these topics maybe from the audience, so please take notes, write down your questions so you can answer or ask them later on. I would like to move from Tunisia to Hong Kong/Hamburg now and introduce Glacier Kwong. Glacier is a digital rights activist born and raised in Hong Kong. She's currently living in self-imposed exile in Hamburg, where she's seeking a PhD at the University of Hamburg, a PhD in law, important to say. And she's the founder of the NGO Keyboard Frontline, monitoring privacy abuses and censorship on the web. And her research focuses on data protection and surveillance in Hong Kong and China. Glacier, why don't you also give us a brief introduction of the topics you've been working on?
I think, like writing on what Kilian said, I think the use of technology or AI or like broad sense technology really depends on who have access to these tools. Like in my situation, AI or technology aren't as empowering as you said because we are facing a totalitarian regime that is the Chinese Communist Party. In 2019, there was a huge democratic movement in Hong Kong that I believe everyone have seen on television. The clashes between protesters and police, all of the protests or the outcry for democracy in Hong Kong. And the movement itself was a leaderless movement, and it was only made available to be leaderless because of technology itself. For example, there are no leaders and there are no decision makers of the movement. Activists that are like really famous, like Joshua Wong, Nathan Lard, they are all facilitators of the movement, but they don't make any call. All decisions are made from a bottom-up approach. Like people would meet online on a Hong Kong version of Reddit, and they would have ideas exchanged, they would have debates, have arguments, and if everyone or most of the people agree on one idea, for example, we all agree to like have advertisement on different newspapers worldwide on the same day to maximize that kind of impact that we have talking about Hong Kong. And so people would exchange their contacts. For example, they would exchange their Telegram ID online, and so they would form Telegram groups that they can, on one hand, remain anonymous, and on the other hand, work together. Like, I have been in contact with these groups. They actually don't know each other even till this point, but they have been working together for years now, like since 2019. And at the same time, it's technology enables us to spread information. I was back in Hong Kong in 2019 for the protest, and I was on the tube, like I was like scrolling my phone on social media, and suddenly someone would like send you an airdrop request. I would like to airdrop you like a few photos. And if you accept that and you open the photos, you would see that it's actually information about when is the next protest happening, where is it, what should you bring with yourself, and what should bear in mind, for example, where are the best escape routes if you're in trouble and so on. Or there would be a photo reminding you, oh, please drink more water, because you have to take care of yourself in order to continue in this movement. So this is how technology is being used for the protest. But at the same time, it's being used against us, for sure. Like, for example, the police are purchasing surveillance tools like facial recognition, a lot of different kind of hacking tools or tools to break into your devices from like foreign countries so that they have access to these tools, and if you're arrested or you're stopped and searched by the police, they will force you to open your phone or they will confiscate your phone so that they can look into your data and then map the entire network of activists or participants. And at the same time, we have this new law called National Security Law that basically enables the government to do whatever they want. They can implement surveillance, they can require you to hand in all data, and you don't actually have the right to remain silent. So the whole civil society is in deep trouble right now. And at the same time, the worst part is that this law enables the government to make data requests to private entities. They can go to Google, they can go to Apple, they can go to Facebook, and ask, I need this person's data. And the big tech companies at the first place said they're not going to hand in any data. But I think today, news broke out in Hong Kong that says Google actually responded to a few requests already, giving out user data. And the problem with that is, we all know how much Google and Facebook knows about that, right? The one point that we talk about traveling to Japan after the pandemic, the next second Google is feeding you with ads about going to Japan. And this is how bad things could be when governmental surveillance works together with commercial surveillance. And this leads to my PhD research topic. I'm looking into how commercial surveillance require us to reassess the data protection regulations that we now have in Europe. I am not sure how many of us really look into the terms and conditions when we click consent, when we download, because I don't as well. Other than doing research, I never actually look into the privacy policy. I just want to get to the point and use that tag, so I would click consent, consent, consent. But this is placing too much burden on the users, and this is not how data protection should work in my mind. So I'm looking into how should we think about reforming this whole thing. And this is the general sense of what I'm doing from an activist perspective and also as a PhD student. And this, I look forward to knowing more about how these things could be used in other contexts so that it doesn't feel so gloomy and depressing for me in a way.
Yeah, you're at this very interesting intersection of having very deep knowledge about from your activist background about what's going on in Hong Kong, and at the same time studying law in Hamburg and reviewing or looking at the tech policies that the EU is working on right now. So we, before the panel, just chatted about DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and what effect that might have on Hong Kong, China, and so on. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, the European Parliament is now undergoing a debate about an act called Digital Marketing Act. That act is mainly a competition law thing, so it's trying to break down the monopoly of Apple and Google and so on. For example, I believe most of us have a smartphone here, but have you ever imagined if a service is not being listed on Apple App Store or Google Play Store, then there is actually nearly impossible for you to have access to that app. Because you can jailbreak your phone for sure, but that means you will lose all warranty and Apple Care if you are using an Apple phone, for example. And this Digital Marketing Act aims to stop this kind of monopoly. And there is a very recent case when the protests broke out in Burma, when the United Nations told people in Burma that you can actually use Proton Mail because it's end-to-end encrypted. That's how you enable secure and safe communication between each other. But then Apple, in response to the government's request, blocked Proton Mail from updating on its App Store. And without the update that is available on the App Store, there's no way that people have access to that update, right? And so having this kind of Digital Marketing Act worldwide in the US or in the EU would help to break these kind of situations, enable access to communications technologies all over the world. Is not only affecting people in Europe and in the US, it will also affect people worldwide, and it will also affect how companies react to government requests like this. And it will enable more technology and tools to be available on these closed platforms in the future. And it will benefit a lot of people like me. For example, if the government decided to act like the government in Beijing, then they can say, oh, I'm blocking VPNs from now on, I'm blocking Signal from now on, then we will be in really deep trouble because we won't be able to have safe ways to communicate with each other. And so there is always this kind of extraterritorial effect of laws in the European Union, in the US, and this is why working on these kind of advocacy is very important as well.
I wish there were more people that could explain these dry DSA, DMA policies and the impact on everyday life of people. Simon Weckert, he traveled all the way from Chemnitz, where he's doing a residency, and his works carry titles like Air Market or the Google Maps hack that you might have seen. The focus of his artistic practice is on the digital world, so everything related to code and electronics. And in his work, he reflects on social aspects of the intersection of tech and society. So he seeks to address the value of technology not only in terms of actual utility, but from the perspective of future generations. And he wants to raise awareness about the privileged state many of us live in and what obligations are attached to this privilege. And Simon, you wanted to talk about to us about one of your artworks, your recent artworks, right?
Yeah, maybe before I start to talk about this one, also to give you maybe a glimpse of what kind of artworks I'm doing. So as you mentioned it, for example, Google Maps hacks, and there's another artwork like air markets, and the one I would like to talk about is called Zapfenstreich, Human Out of the Loop. These artworks. Basically, for me, they represent some kind of, let's say, journalism thing. So as I grow up with the internet, with technology, I also basically studied art with much more in the context of digital narratives, tools, in a really critical point of view. I always wanted to tell stories basically about these systems we are using every day, and basically one big aim of my artworks is to give, let's say, some kind of narratives back to the society, to the people, to understand what's going on behind this or inside of these black boxes. Not, in just writing down the text. I think it's more like in a let's say easy and let's say understandable way to read, and basically to catch people which maybe don't feel so comfortable with these kind of topics. Because what I learn or what I see is that as you said, like we're in a bubble here, technology related, but when you talk to people who really don't, basically just consuming this technology, like when you talk with them about it, they're basically blinding out everything, and it's like too complicated for them to really go deeper into it. And I think it's super necessary that we also somehow invite those people to these aspects of, for example, AI, but also new technologies. And for example, like last year I did a performance which is called Google Maps Hacks, and I used 99 smartphones and carried these smartphones in a little hand wagon behind me in the streets of Berlin. And this had the effect after a while that I generated virtual traffic on Google Maps, and therefore cars had been rerouted around me, and after a while the streets were getting, let's say, more and more empty by cars. And this was like a, let's say, good example, I think, to show people, how data can be used also against them, or basically how these tools like Google Maps, digital maps, can also route us in a way how we would like to. And and actually for this panel discussion, I brought the artwork which is called Zapfenstreich. And of course, like 5 years ago, the topic of AI came back into the media art world. And I had a look at how these systems, how these AI technology is also being used in modern warfare, and I came across with autonomous weapon systems, which is actually some kind of, let's say, very critical, crucial, and really important part that's going to be discussed in the United Nations at the moment. And there are also some campaigns. They are called Stop Killer Robots, and basically the aim is that they want to make those states aware of that when they're going to start to develop, and companies already starting to work on it, but when militaries or states going to use this kind of autonomous weapon systems, then we're going to entering such tremendous, basically ethical and moral questions for the modern war field that needs definitely to be discussed in a wider society. And right now it's much more like a discussion behind closed doors, and actually it's really like this kind of really closed small group of people which basically defines if you're going to use the systems or not. And basically autonomous weapon systems in its own, it's somehow the question like what makes a machine autonomous or not. That's another, let's say, discussion we cannot talk about today, but in the end, I think it's important to mention that right now we have some kind of paradigm change, meaning that back in the days, we had the military, which basically developed, let's say, technology, new systems, and then we took that to the civil sector. Right now, we have private companies like Google, like Amazon, and so on. They are developing AI systems, and this is going to be taken by the military for their systems. And I think here we definitely have to point out, we have to basically talk to those companies. We have to also motivate employees at these companies to basically fight against this kind of technology, this kind of investment into algorithms which is going to be used for pattern recognition on the battlefield. And they're really gonna, stay there and say like, look, actually, that's how far we go, and no step more. And well, what I did in the artwork was I took basically some kind of AI algorithm and I trained it to play a trumpet autonomously. And the trumpet is playing the melody of Zapfenstreich, and this melody was used back in the days by the military to symbolize the soldiers to retreat from the battleground. And like in this artwork, I basically asked the question like, how would be, let's say, the new melody or the new narrative could look like when we have autonomous weapons there, what would be the symbol for them, how we can retreat them from the battleground. And I tried to combine that in an object which is called Zapfenstreich, human out of the loop, a self-playing trumpet.
Thanks. You shared a report with me by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that shows that more than 380 partly autonomous weapon systems have been deployed or are being developed in 12 different countries around the globe. Iron Dome is one of them that people might know. And what stood out to me is when reading about killer robots, like feminism popped up quite often, right? Like the Women's League for Peace and Freedom, then there's feminist foreign policy. So what do killer robots have to do with feminism?
Well, I don't know. I would say that it's more also the question of how, I mean, also as you mentioned, like how these systems have been trained on, like what is the data behind it, and which kind of bias comes in this data, right? And I mean, right now we're going to use these algorithms, and most of the time they are coming from much more like a white, male-dominated, masculine data set, basically. And this means that a lot of people are, excluded, included, and these systems, they are somehow also they have some kind of tensions, or maybe questions coming up for gender, race, sex, and so on. And these are subjects, they are not, let's say, really discussed in the data set. And suddenly you see that there are some tensions how they act. And for example, especially for autonomous weapon systems, as we have, or as we know that especially weapons and this development is very masculine and very violent, basically also means that those systems, they're really much more targeting men in that sense. And I would say that not all men basically are supporting the idea of that we should have this kind of dead, violent, killing robots. But the thing is that in its own data set, it's basically always targeting basically men on the one hand, because they are actually some kind of a source of this. So and I think, for example, there definitely needs another input first of all, in a way of where does the data comes from, and also how is the system, the neural network, for example, constructed.
So very different, thank you for the inputs, very different perspectives and also different backgrounds on this stage. We have 54 minutes to dig a little deeper and to add AI to all of these topics, or to try to also talk about AI. So to kick us off, I was wondering, what are common mainstream narratives and discourses around AI that annoy you the most, that you perceive as dangerous and wrong? And what are new narratives that you are exploring in your work? So just to give you an example of a narrative that annoys me a lot when we talk or when I read about AI, is this notion of the AI arms race. that who's first in the AI arms race and what role does Europe play in all of this. So are there any narratives that you can spontaneously think of when you think about AI or also emerging technology that you're worried about or that annoy you? Who has a first quick answer? Caroline?
I mean, there's like a few that I find annoying, though I also just generally, I find myself falling out of love with AI the more that I like look at it or work with it. But I think one of the things I've noticed, I've been working on a project with a criminal justice publication in New Orleans where I'm from called The Lens. We've been looking at a survey of surveillance. That is, some of it's using artificial intelligence, some of it is not, in the city of New Orleans. And one of the things that's really interesting that we've sort of been unpacking is New Orleans is not a tech city. It is like a very big city for Louisiana, but it is not a tech epicenter. And so what that means is on a local level, a lot of local politicians, a lot of local bureaucrats don't have a grounding or understanding in technology. What's interesting is also that a lot of the activists don't either, but there's been a coalition of activists across musicians, sex workers, like black youth coming together to protest and form a group called Eye on Surveillance to try to document and check the surveillance that is growing in New Orleans. So all this means is that there is like it's a very interesting space to study tech discourse and to also be involved in it. Most of the politicians there, because they don't have a background in technology, think that at some point this can be fixed. Well, we can't have facial recognition now in the cameras, but eventually facial recognition is going to get better and accurate, right? And then we could use it. And so it's a very difficult conversation to have with a group of people that hold a lot of power that have no basis in or understanding in technology. So how do you have a conversation about facial recognition if we're also like, do you know how the web is built? Like, do you know what JavaScript is? Like, they're like, no. So it's been a very interesting project. So it's very different from the discourse I had when I lived in New York, when I lived in San Francisco, when I lived in Berlin. It's extremely different. And so that's one of the things I find really annoying is like, well, we can fix facial recognition. It's like the whole premise of facial recognition is messed up. So no, you can't fix a broken concept, right? And then it's even more important to have that conversation in the city of New Orleans where Louisiana has the highest rate of incarceration in the United States, and the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. So if Louisiana was its own country, it would have the most incarcerated people in the world, right? And it's not a very big state. It's not a very big population at all. So thinking about how technology is used in policing is extraordinarily important. Thinking about who understands technology or who's creating or passing these laws and ordinances is extremely important. Right before the pandemic, the city of New Orleans was crippled by a cybersecurity attack. And going to the pandemic, the city was still crippled by that. So like they're purchasing all kinds of technology that they don't quite understand. And I find that very alarming and very important to look at. So the most difficult conversation is sometimes trying to tell politicians, like, you don't know what you're talking about, and I lack the language to say that to you respectfully, even though we're both speaking English.
So deploying technology right now and then fixing it later, very worrying narrative. Kilian.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of torn between the two because, I mean, I've been working in context of war and terror. I've been working with a number of intelligence agencies or in the context of intelligence agencies in the middle of civil war, rebels. I know people have been operating drones or coordinating the drone war in certain regions of the world and so on and so forth. So there is that very evil, bad thing somehow. And then I'm, on the other hand, and I correct my statement from before, I'm not the extraterrestrian, you are. Because there's 6 billion people or so, which are far from that. And there's 2 billion or something, I mean, inventing these figures, I have no intelligence to say, but that's my feeling, who have that access or are subject to all of this. So for me, the social use of all these tools, and I put that into one bag, AI and virtual reality, augmented reality, and whatnot. I put that in all one bag of how can we capture it? How can we make it useful? I mean, I have a friend who works on future storytelling with the help of VR in contexts of village visions, helping populations to look forward, develop their plans, their strategies, and things like that. How can we use such tools in a much more effective way? How can we take them over? I was very impressed in the recent weeks because, although I'm not personally, but friends are involved in evacuation in Afghanistan. I mean, there were maps and so on, and I'm part of networks of réseau, which I would see exactly every single Taliban checkpoint and guiding people of how to get around these checkpoints. I mean, that's fascinating. That's how we can fight systems like in Hong Kong or elsewhere. The only problem is that the system is controlled by those big companies. So how do we capture that? How we take it over? That's my real thing. How do we create a social Google? How do we help my friend who is a Berber in the Berber village to use all these tools in a more effective way, where he asked me, can you find me the use of that herb which is growing in my yard, and I don't know, in the mountain here, and I don't know how to use it. So that's my question here. So that's very, very evil part, and the potential to really change the world and make that globe, that brain the globe is, in fact, capable to survive in a more sustainable way.
So how can we build alternatives to the tech that we have right now is a narrative that you're exploring.
That is my big narrative of how can we counter that control by those big giants.
I appreciate you saying that, because that's one of the things that's come up in our research in New Orleans is how much technology cities are buying in a way to alleviate or update, but it's all owned by proprietary companies. And so one of the things that's sort of coming out, at least in New Orleans, is like, well, what's going to happen if the technology you're buying is sunset by AT&T or Google? What are you going to do? And I'm thinking of Google Fiber, where they laid down, miles and miles and miles of fiber cables and then just ripped it up or like abandoned it. And it's something, I think it's really important that we need civic technology alternatives to this, because what happens when a company is like, we're done? Or, oh, we're just going to, maybe we're using the data from the city in this other way. I mean, it creates massive holes for that city, right? It is not sustainable.
I think writing on that, I'd say this leads to the myth that frustrates me the most. It's you pay with your data now in the age of AI or big data, because it shouldn't have to be like that. There are examples. It's not infrastructure examples. For example, there are open source tools that you can use that don't exploit your data and don't exploit you as a person or your agency in general to make a profit. For example, there are open source communication tools that rely solely on open source efforts, like people in the community checking all the codes behind that tool, or people donating to that community and so on. And this phrase of you don't pay with money now, you pay with your data, is just so wrong in my opinion. And I think it kind of relates to the things that you it kind of interacts with that, because our data, it's not like something we can own. Your time, your money, you can give it out, and there's not, how should I say it? Your data, it's your height, your weight, or your facial things, it sticks with you. You can't really change it. Of course, you can have a plastic surgery, but this is an exceptional case. And these things cannot be sold because it's forever relatable to you, your preferences and so on. These things should not be treated as a commodity in all sense. And this is something, when we talk about developments of technology, that people often don't want to think about. They're like, oh, but if you put on stricter data protection regulations, if you change the model of consent, then you're going to stop technology from developing, because to develop AI, to develop these tools, we need training data and so on. And there is a very famous case of Flickr. They're using CC licenses. And then BMI ripped that whole set of photos from Flickr to train their facial recognition technology, because those photos are copyrighted materials, but the facial features of the people are their personal data. So this is this very interesting dynamic between if you treat personal data or any sorts of personal data like commodity, then these problems will follow. And this is something we can never solve. It's not like entirely, as you guys said, it's a problem of infrastructure, but this is something, if we want to go forward with thinking about a new digital deal, or how do we use technology to empower the minorities, those people who are not connected yet, I think these are the things we have to solve, because there are a lot of people that are not equipped with, I don't know, like a lot of these legal knowledge or understanding of how do their personal data works. And once they get connected, if nobody tell them these things, it would be like we would be taking advantage of them because they don't have the adequate knowledge to defend themselves against being exploited in that sense.
Simon,
Yeah.
worrying narratives. I mean, I guess as an artist, you work a lot with narratives, right?
Exactly.
So,
But actually, what I also see right now, like when I work with AI technology as an artist, what I see, I'm super limited with these tools. So that actually is somehow like a new thing for me as well, because basically you have like this kind of let's say pre-trained models, or this kind of neural network constructions. It's actually like a tool I cannot really change in a way that I would like to. And I think for me, like when it comes to AI technology, that's a really crucial and somehow also misleading thing. We see that right now, that these models, this technology is really just defined by a special group of people and companies, organizations. And I think that's something that's super special for that. So also, I mean, I'm also part of a research team for, let's say, machine learning in the context of museums. And basically, we also did some studies around like how can we change these systems and where does it comes from. And it looks like this, that actually most of them, they're coming from a few universities or from a few companies. And those companies or these universities, of course, as they're creating new models, they're also getting, let's say, new fundings and, well, basically new projects and so on, new data sets, interesting data sets and so on. So basically, I would say that rich getting richer in a way is this term of, you know, that let's say companies or institutions which successful trained those or got some results are getting also really new projects and new fundings for AI technology. And here it needs to open, we have to open that and also, let's say, get people more to that resources, you know, from different alternatives, backgrounds and so on, to work with these tools and open actually also that field, so that more people are being invited to also criticize in a way, to questioning, but also to experiment with it.
so overhyped and shiny, while things, when you dig a little deeper, are not
I mean, you will. Yeah.
functioning as frictionless and as well as we think. Before we move into the visions part, because actually this panel has a very kind of positive title, and when I read the title of the panel for the first time, I thought, wow, this sounds very tech solutionist in a way, the title of it being How AI Infrastructures Can Advance the Public Good. And I felt a bit like we're framing everything around the technology and not really addressing the underlying problems. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about tech solutionism and what you see or what you experience in your field. Like Caroline, for example, when you talk about the city of New Orleans and new facial recognition programs being rolled out, like what are the problems that the city is trying to solve? Is this also part of what Evgeny Morozov calls tech solutionism, that we're just rolling out things and trying to fix problems without understanding the systemic nature of the problems?
I mean, a very short answer, like, yes, but I guess in a beginning, longer answer, I would say a lot of things are complicated. And I'm going to break this answer apart in a few different pieces. And one of the first things I will say, though, is there are upsides at times to using for-profit technology. A lot of open source technology is not accessible. It's not easy to use for people with like low vision or like neurodivergence, or just also it's not following modern like usability standards. And so I do want to sort of highlight and say, like, there are reasons, very good reasons to use for-profit technology at times. And I think that this is, you know, a detriment to the open source community that we do not invest in resources to make our technology accessible or usable, and that is an extraordinarily big issue. We can't leave people behind, and we're currently doing that in the way that we build things. A command line is not accessible. And I just sort of want to highlight that very quickly, and that's what I mean also, that these are very complicated topics, right? And that is one thing at times that some big tech companies do better, is at least making some technology accessible. Does it honor our data privacy? Not at all. And those are a trade-off, a real trade-off people have to make, right? And that's, I think, one thing really important to highlight. Now, with the New Orleans example, the problem with New Orleans is systemic racism. Like, that's one of the biggest issues. You know, New Orleans is in the Deep South. New Orleans is a city built on top of like chattel slavery. New Orleans is a city that is predominantly black, but has, you know, has no idea how to deal with diversity at all, as well as acknowledging its systemic racism. And so it's also a city, again, that has the highest rate of incarceration. That affects black people, right? Mm-hmm. And so facial recognition is used in different kinds of surveillance cameras. Predictive policing tools have been used without like the city's knowledge before. But it's already a system on top of that that incarcerates one population more than another population. It over-polices those neighborhoods. And those are things that were done even prior to us introducing artificial intelligence into the conversation. And so artificial intelligence can't fix problems in New Orleans, right? Technology can't fix problems there. Mm-hmm. There's already human problems that are made. And so I think in some cases, if we're looking particularly at New Orleans, a lot of the technology that's being purchased by the city, some of it is trying to improve 911 calls or improve connectivity. And a lot of other tools are also just for different kinds of policing or different kinds of surveillance. And it's worth like looking at how much that budget is used in the city. New Orleans is also a very poor city in comparison to other cities in the United States. Our streets are constantly falling apart. We were just hit by a hurricane, for example. The city has been, parts of the city have been without power since Hurricane Ida hit at the very end of August. It's hot there. People are dying from heat. And one of the things I'm reflecting on is when I was interviewing a member of ION Surveillance, what they talked about was, imagine if the money that was taken towards like a large chunk of the police budget or towards surveillance, it was put towards something else. What could we produce then? How could we benefit the community? What dreams could we foster? And I think about that a lot. Or if it was just put towards shoring up our infrastructure to ensure that people have electricity after a Category 4 hurricane. Parts of the state even are still underwater. You know, so I mean, like, this is where I'm talking about all these much more like difficult problems. And we're talking about this in like a first world nation, which is the United States. So there are all these other issues. So like when I think of techno-solutionism, I think that there are things that could solve there. If we're referring to artificial intelligence in the city of New Orleans with policing, like there are much bigger problems we need to solve before we even start to introduce that into the conversation.
Kilian, what are you?
Yeah.
I'm sure Kilian has lots of ideas, having worked in disaster more than I have, actually.
So many things. But I give you an example of what we're doing now, or what we have been building over the last 6 months, with a ridiculous budget of so far 30,000 euros, roughly. We have been mapping all the institutions, associations, civil society groups providing social support in Tunisia. So we entered all of that. I mean, that's data, looking for data on the net, calling, but it's also very analog, so we have to call people, and so we're bringing all that together because we want to make that available. We want to develop that as a tool, first of all, for our clients, being migrants, people who have been really in trouble, but then we're going further for people who are in need of some point of assistance, being drug support, women in trouble, and so on and so forth. So we're developing that into a next generation tool with basically no resources. I mean, that's it's unique. It doesn't really exist in this way in the world as we speak. So we want to have people having access at any moment to where can I get support with A, B, C, D now, as well, of course, for practitioners, social workers, counselors, etc., etc. So building up for a whole nation, basically, a referral system, and as well helping to identify where are the gaps, where there is no safe house for a woman. We know already at this point, and we can advise and guide public investment or donors in the case of Tunisia where to go. There we're looking, and this is in a way an appeal here, we're looking for more resources, we're looking for tech resources, we're looking of course for money, but building that together, and we can use such a tool and replicate that. It does not exist, and it's very easy.
Is this registry like from a central entity, so the central entity then adds more contact and information, or is it so that that it's open source and people can just contribute and add to the resource?
I mean, on one hand, we have built the basic database, if you wish. That starts somewhere. So I've been going and scanning the web for all sorts of things. We have been calling institutions, and now we're getting into the next stage where we want to have that accessible for people so that they can provide an open source also. I mean, does the thing even function? I mean, is that center even open? Because it may not be open, etc. There is an example in Germany, which friends of mine are doing that. That's Karuna in Berlin. They're doing an app which is called Mokli, M-O-K-L-I, which is helping homeless youth or homeless to find support at any moment. It's basically a Google Map thing, but very easy thing. So. Yes, we're looking into an open source feedback process. We're looking into institutional feeding in, and we're looking into, I mean, a sort of a very analog verification as well of, well, the thing has been closed. No, this center doesn't support people of another color, another nationality or so, which is important in the case of migrants, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But that's sort of a practical application of how we can build tools which make a change. Because what's happening again right now is that the majority of the Earth population has a feeling that they're left behind in many senses. And there are more resources than we believe. Yeah. Even in Tunisia, we found suddenly, well, there is more than we think. There is an oversupply in some areas, and there's an undersupply, obviously, somewhere else.
And access to information is oftentimes the first step, but also I'd like to move to Glacier. You talked about low tech in a way, right? When you were talking about the airdrop stuff, because in Hong Kong during the protests, people are often prone to throw high-tech situations or the next big app at things, but sometimes in order to not be surveilled or to slip through the cracks of surveillance, using low-tech, very basic infrastructure and solutions can also come in handy. So from what you've experienced at the protest, like the airdrop stuff, what are other low-tech solutions that people have been using? And maybe also this notion of centralization versus decentralization, right? Which was also something that we could observe during the umbrella movement versus the most recent protests.
I'd say the safest way to not leave digital footprints, and my digital security training is not to use anything. So don't use it as the safest way. But it's impossible. Like in Hong Kong in the protests recently, the airdrop thing is a thing. And other low-techs, more low-techs idea would be protesters are trying to avoid arrests, right? Because we are the rioters, quote unquote. And so there will be people who are voluntarily taking up the responsibility of reporting where do they see police and police cars. And the easiest way to spread that information out is we use Telegram channels. And because on Telegram you can remain anonymous, and there are ways you can get a burner phone and a burner SIM card, and that will minimize the risk of you being digitally hunted down. And so people are using this kind of very grassroots approaches to notify each other, and there will be people using that information to plot maps and open source tools so that people can contribute and at the same time use that tool. For example, I've been doing a project of trying to, like in Hong Kong, trying to locate where the CCTVs are, and there are other attempts of doing so, like in very popular protest sites, there will be like people just plotting Google Maps and put it online and say, oh, these are the areas with the most CCTV. So if you're gonna get change, if you're gonna plant something, don't do it around this area because it's dangerous. Like, so there are all these very like grassroots approach of using technology, but this will never solve, like it solved problems for sure. It made protesters' lives much easier, but it will never solve the issues of having an authoritarian regime or having a lot of like social injustice in our society. So the question that you posed at the beginning, like, does it solve things? Yes, but it really depends on what is the things that you want to solve, even in the bigger picture. Like, if we're talking about the so-called New Digital Deal, are we talking about solving issues, as Kilian posted, like, can we find help or how do we find help? Yes, that it can solve it, but can it solve the deep-rooted issues behind lacking connectivity? I kind of doubt that, because you need to be connected first and then you have access to those like tools, technology, and internet. And when it comes back to the Hong Kong example, in 2014, I'd say no people ever cared about how do you use technology. People just use it without thinking. People would post, even I would like post about being in a protest on Facebook. That basically means arrest nowadays if you do that in Hong Kong. And in 2019, people are reaching out for help. They would go to international organizations and said, can you help me train some digital security trainers so that I can tell people how do they use communication tools safely? How do I encrypt my files? How do I don't leave the least digital footprints when I'm planning a campaign and so on? So this is the change that I see. Like, people are more and more aware of how do we use it safely and how do we protect ourselves when we're doing it, because we know the government or the opponents have more access to different technologies than we do. And I think this huge power imbalance not only happens between users and governments, it also happens between users and private entities. Like Facebook and Google will decide what I get to see online, and Facebook and Twitter have been like hiding some of the protest materials because this was seen as violent or too bloody in general, because like people are getting hurt. And why do these online platforms get to decide what I see online? And because usually no one actually get to like decide for you what you want to see unless it is the government or the court. But when private entities get to do so, how do we hold them accountable? And then we realize users don't actually have a say in their content moderation policy, or even their content moderation policies are very intransparent. So these are the problems that comes with having technology to solve some of your problems. But deep, like as you said, like it's human problems that requires human solution, and technology can only solve so far as technological problem or problem that could be solved by tools.
Yeah. Simon, how is this connected to your work? Do we oftentimes only scratch the surface when we talk about tech and how to solve problems? Are you trying to dig deeper and show like the systemic nature of problems, or how do you approach tech solutionism? Also low-tech versus high-tech approaches?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like technology also can be seen as some kind of catalyzer for society, right? It's more like multiplying social issues we have already there. I mean, of course, it also goes in the direction, okay, it can be technology neutral, which I think it cannot be, because it was always made for a specific purpose. Those tools and how we gather data, for example. I think also like the term of data visualization is somehow also nonsense, because data in its own is also some kind of interpretation of the real world, right? And therefore we can also never see data as a representative for the real world. It's really just interpretation of the real world, right? But there's much more than this. So, but yeah, I mean, of course, I think like when we talk about technology in that sense, in the end, we're always talking about us, right? And how we're gonna, and we're trying to, it's more like put some medicine and, hope that it's gonna solve the problem. But in the end, I think it always comes down to the interaction between us as humans and, I don't know, things like, that people have to live on the street, homeless people, this cannot be solved by technology. That's definitely a bigger question we have to raise there, right? and so on. I mean, that's definitely always what I see when we talk about technology. So yeah.
Yeah, and when you think about power, so more and more scholars in AI say that it's time to stop talking about ethics and to talk about power instead. So power relations, existing power structures that are amplified by the technology that we're using. And there's also this quote by Audre Lorde, I think, that needs to be quoted more: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may only allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So when we talk about power, and we've already mentioned, like, there's the big tech corporations versus people who are trying to build open source software, alternatives, decentralized systems. So what are the power shifts, Simon, that you would like to see in the future? Or what power needs to be unveiled a bit more? And what power shifts would like to see when you think about AI, emerging tech, the topics of this festival as well?
Right. I mean, what I see at the moment is more this thing, it's getting more specialized. So for example, you have a company which is called OpenAI, and they have a model that's called GPT-3, which is basically used for text generation, or generating for example, chatbots, and it can be used for elections. Right now in Germany, for sure it's going to be used on social media and so on. And the thing is that it is such a powerful tool. You can do so many things with it. It's actually quite cool. On the one hand, I definitely have to say that it's insane what you can do with it. But on the other hand, it's also like this, that they actually not publishing this model. So basically, nobody really knows what's behind that. So nobody knows what this model was trained on, and nobody knows really, where the data comes from. And I mean, like, there are already some studies around it, and we can definitely say that this model was trained for 90% in English texts and so on. And of course, that means that there's also already a bias in it. And to eliminate this, or to basically make the, also point that out, it's super hard if you don't have the model, if you don't know where the data comes from. So with regards to AI, I think it's super crucial that when we're designing, or when companies are designing these systems, they have to make it much, much more transparent as it is these days. And they really have to show things like, okay, we took this data, this was the training time. Also, actually, we didn't discuss it, but right now it's really like this, that people are just training their models. It's insane energy waste what we're going to use there at the moment. It's really insane, like natural language processing models. And anyway, and this kind of stuff also needs to be reported. And I think it's also important that we're going to show that also as well. Like, look, actually, what you're using here, this technology, it's cool, but you can do it. But the other hand, or the backside, of that is actually what comes with this and that. So therefore, more transparency, I think it's a crucial part.
Yeah, and the resources part is an interesting too, right? Yesterday there was the branch symposium. You might have seen the poster in front of this space, and the symposium was about a sustainable internet. So also talking about the resources and the inequalities that are at the very core, or that start when it comes to like mining minerals and so on. So this is another big discussion. I don't want to go there right now because we don't have time, because we obviously want to hear the questions that you in the audience have. But the branch symposium yesterday was all about this. So just a little kind of segue or like hint to like check out the talks. Talking about power and unveiling power, like who else has thoughts on where we need to dig deeper, what things we still need to uncover, and what shifts you would like to see, or we would need to see in the future to work towards just and inclusive digital spaces? Caroline?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for everything you said, Simon. I really agree with that, and that's part of a new project that my collaborator Emily Denton and I are starting to fundraise for, a research project where we want to interview artists, core AI scientists, ethical AI scientists, policy regulators, activists, and everyday people, just actually around when should you use or not use AI, and to actually try to build more responsible AI what are the different kinds of benchmarks you need to ensure? And part of that's even actually looking at where it's created. Should it ever be created inside of a corporation? You know, if we're reflecting on how often papers get killed internally, right? Referencing Google, for example. Should it be in a cooperative? How do you actually ensure that like the labor that's producing this work is also equitable, for example? Are people treated well? How are they paid? What are the reasons that something is being explored or not explored? And that often we divorce that from the research itself, but I think the labor of production actually needs to be put back into the conversation. Then are there certain topics that should be verboten, for example? Like should AI, with how energy intensive it is, be used in analyzing climate change, even though it works, it can work particularly well in that area? You know, is that something that's counterintuitive? There are obvious things of what should be, you know, verboten with like facial recognition or defense tools, but you know, then looking at that and then saying the next step is then how do you build with it? And then what are those, again, the constraints or the structures you need? And that's something we've just been thinking a lot about, which is, I think too often, and I'm speaking primarily as an American, I think too often we just sort of accept that a lot of these tools and groundbreaking work is done in a for-profit environment. But like more and more and more, as we sort of hear about the internal problems with those teams, of how they're mistreated, of what they are and aren't allowed to produce, I think that needs to be looked at much more. And also, I think we should look at it in a CSO and NGO environment where people are underpaid and overworked, right? And I think this is something funders have to talk about. Why do they fund certain entities? Who gets money? Why are there certain rock stars that produce certain kinds of work when other regions, other researchers are completely overlooked, for example? And I think we can't separate that anymore from the research. It's a conversation we have to have. Who is funded, and then what are the labor constraints within that of how people are treated or mistreated?
I mean, funding is maybe a good segue into Kilian's work, because you mentioned like 30,000 euros, was it? Or like how much do you have for? So something we also see, and something Pia Mancini mentioned yesterday at the branch symposium, is that there's a funding issue, that the money stays in the north, especially when it comes to tech development, and then we then export all of our solutions to the global south or to disadvantaged countries. So this notion of power and power shifts that you would like to see, like how does that resonate with your work? And maybe also, like, if you want a more concrete question, since you mentioned the facial recognition software, biometric systems that are used at our borders in refugee camps, like how are the power asymmetries there, like the imbalances? Do people have a chance to opt out of these systems? Do they have agency to opt out of these systems? Like,
okay, there are many questions.
yeah, sorry. Maybe
in
two different questions there.
I mean, the funding issue is a big issue, because I really think we need more money, basically, to build social tools. Access to what the world can do, it needs funding, full stop. And there is nobody really behind that. So
and who is we?
I mean, well, it's those who are activists, those who are in building up networks, who are building or working on that connectivity between the unconnected communities and people of this world, and so on and so forth. There is many of us who are trying. I mean, we're trying to bring them together. We're trying to build a platform of those who have social projects and social ideas connected to data, connected to all these different various applications which can be thought of, and which can make the world a little bit more just, and again help millions, if not billions, of people to access what the rich part of the world has invented or done, or sometimes the low-tech part of the world has also experienced, and there's somebody else somewhere else in the world who has already made that experience, and that's why we're talking about the switchboard. We're talking about putting the cables together still, because not everybody is capable of connecting on digital platforms. So money, investment, putting the ideas together, building these ecosystems which connect, making it more independent from whatever is decided somewhere in Silicon Valley or somewhere else. That's certainly one demand and one absolutely necessary part, because otherwise the world will implode, and we know already it's not sustainable. We can't continue. So survival means better connection of those who are not connected. The second part, when you're talking about, can you repeat the?
Yeah, it was about like something just struck me when you mentioned it at the beginning, that facial recognition and biometric systems are used in refugee camps, and obviously there's some advantages to those systems, but then there's also a big power asymmetry between the ones who decide to use the systems and the ones who then have to scan their faces and may not be able to opt out of the usage of these systems, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I come really from a sort of a more pragmatic point of view. So, I mean, I have seen the positive applications for millions of people. It was, for me, as a practitioner in the field, much easier to work with large populations because suddenly we were using these tools. I mean, and so I'm balancing out. So I'm saying, well, it's maybe not a good idea. I mean, we had, for instance, big issues with the Afghans when we did the registration by facial and fingerprints, because, of course, our dear friends, the Afghan men, decided that their women should not be recognizable, and there were basically fatwas issues and so on. And so in the end, we missed something like 400,000 Afghan women in the registration of Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Because the men didn't allow them to show up because there was something like this involved. So what does it mean? It means that we can't really access these women again. By the way, quite an interesting thing the Pakistani government is doing through the National Authority for Data Management and Registration, which is Big Brother. But they're doing a number of things to actually get and document people with a very, very big focus on women. So there's all sorts of tricks to get women registered and documented. There is, for instance, the Benazir Bhutto income support scheme, where the families receive money through the woman in the household. So suddenly the man has to actually accept that the woman gets registered and documented. And gets an identity, and it's not just called woman anymore, because many men don't even know the first name of their wife, and it's somebody who brings in a certain amount of money into the family, so suddenly a value. So I mean, there are things like that where I feel, yes, it makes sense. When we had the big floods of 2010, big first warning sign, climate change is a reality. 17 million people affected, 10 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. It wasn't doable in distributing blankets and tents anymore. We needed to work on smart solutions. And the second thing of that, it basically flushed out, the floods flushed out all the poor people from the countryside who were basically slaves and so on and so forth. And so it helped actually to give them an identity so that the landowners and basically the slaveholders in the rural Sind of southern Pakistan or somewhere were suddenly forced to accept that their workers were somebody, they were actually human beings. Mm-hmm. So identity registration has in such context a very, very big significance to bring them out of being anonymous things and make women and men and children human beings.
Another big topic to unpack maybe in next year's Ars Electronica, digital identity. Glacier, we have 10 minutes left. Maybe briefly before we open up to questions, when you hear Audre Lorde say the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, does that resonate with you? Does your work connect to that?
More or less. Like, how should I put it? I think having technology in one hand makes activism for me much more easier because, as you mentioned when you introduced me, I am self-imposed exile. That means I cannot go back to Hong Kong because of the activism that I do. Basically, sitting here talking to all of you violates national security law. I'm colluding with foreign forces, and without technology, none of my activism would be possible because, as an Hong Kong activist, you still have to be connected to the local community, even though I'm part of a diasporic community now. And technology enables that and enables it to happen safely. But it also makes me, as this young scholar, it worries me as like writing on the example you mentioned, the same thing is like identity registration is happening in China under the social credit system. That means everything is recorded and you actually don't have an opt-out to that. If you do not exist on the system, you do not exist in the society. If you don't have a good enough score, then you don't have schools, you don't have access to supermarkets, you don't have access to public toilet papers. And this is what's happening in China. So I think I understand how empowering this could be, but I have seen the worst side of things. So I'm still stuck in between being optimistic and being very pessimistic because I understand how it helps to have an identity in a society because my identity is what keeping me going forward as an activist, and it is how people feel empowered in many other places. But in China or in the society that I live in, it's not really much the same. So I would have to insist it really depends on how you use it. So I'd say yes and no to that question in general.
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm just trying to say...
This is where the tension comes out, because you're not part of that part of the world's population which doesn't live with the famous under $1 a day and so on, and where identity means survival.
Yes.
Right, and so on. So that's is almost, this discussion is wild in a way, because for you it means identity means, in the context of China, means control, it means to be reprimanded if you don't perform. In other contexts, it means access to society. I mean, I work in Ethiopia right now on having hundreds of thousands of people getting out of informality because it excludes them from the little bit what is there. So, I mean, the discussion of informality in existence versus identity and formality and being part of, yes, a capitalist system or a repressive system, that's the question. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there is still many people who would like to have somehow more than the survival.
Yes.
Dear audience, do you have questions for us? If so, then please raise your hands. Here's a question. So 1, 2, we're just going to collect some questions. First one, second one.
Yes, I heard a lot of who owns the technology, and it's important who owns and who has the tools. Yeah, we see that the GAFA companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on, they have the technology, they have the connectivity, they have the AI. So the economists would say, okay, you just get into the market, you smash those corporations, the monopolies. Are there other answers to that? How to get that technology to you, to your organizations, for the use for the civil agencies or for the NGOs? So is there another options than to smash those monopolies?
Whom are you directing this question to?
I think to all of the audience who is part of an NGO, who makes some activism, because you always said you have the problem to connect, and if the connection is turned down, like Lukashenko does now in Belarus, yeah, just switch off. So then you can't connect. So these technologies are in the hand of some of monopolies. So how do you, is there another answer than the economists would say? So I come from Attac Austria, which means political activism for economy. So the economists would say, smash those GAFA companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. Maybe there are other solutions. Do you have an idea? I don't have, so this is what I'm asking.
Yeah. Cool, we're gonna note this question down and maybe also take the second question.
Oh, she has to
Is it
disinfect the mic
first?
first.
Ah, okay. Mic disinfection, very important.
Beautiful.
Okay, very safe.
That's the proof.
Yeah, maybe connecting to the last question. So, in my opinion, the technology is available. I mean, the whole internet is implemented on an open source software, Linux and Unix. And all of the neural network technology is available. The only power the companies like Amazon and Google and so forth have is they're sitting on a bunch of data. Yeah, really, we don't have that data available for the people. Although there are many people and they can collect many data, even maybe many more data. And the big networks like the GPT-3 that you mentioned is available to everyone. You can just use this and utilize it. So I'm missing a little bit, and that would be the question. Are there ideas to somehow, in a subversive or open source manner, to counterbalance the power there? I mean, it has never been more technology openly available before.
But where does Linux comes from?
Open source.
Exactly, yeah. And where does TensorFlow comes from? From a private company. That's actually, I mean, we should not forget, like, for example, it's public because of a leak. So basically somebody leaked it and they used this technology years before. And actually, if nobody leaked it, then probably you wouldn't know this. So, and the thing is, like, I don't know, I mean, I see tensions, you know, that we have TensorFlow or we have these kind of frameworks and they're cooperating with companies like NVIDIA, for example, and there's basically hardware made for the software. And this is, for me, then not open source anymore because you're basically somehow, I don't know, forced actually to use that in a way. And, you know, the thing is, of course, on the software level, I think that's definitely possible, but when it comes to the connection to a hardware level, then in that sense, we are somehow forced to use them.
I think one thing also, just to briefly interrupt, first of all, if you have access to GPT-3, I would love your access information because I've requested it multiple times and have not received any access. So would love your credentials. Well, I'll find you afterwards. Taking a different step, I'm going to speak more from like a civic technology standpoint, particularly when it comes to like building products. Healthcare.gov, which was the United States' like online interface to access healthcare, failed when it was first launched. I think at the end of the day, only 8 people could register. 2 different entities came together that are now like more public benefit corporations, Ad Hoc and NAVA, to completely rebuild that sign-up website. So when I think of like the problems facing people, I'm thinking from a product standpoint. Healthcare.gov is a product standpoint. There are like many big companies, IBM, where I used to work, Deloitte, for example, that will buy or will be hired to build a product inside the United States, like signing up for health benefits, and they'll build it not very well, like as we saw with healthcare.gov. So I think part of the issue comes down towards like we may have a lot of open source technology, you still have to wrap that into a product that people can use. And that has to be usable, that has to function with 1 billion users. So I think part of the issue does also come down to, at least from this very, very United States standpoint, what local government or federal government is, you know, like who are they hiring to build the digital civic tech that they need, i.e. signing up for like food benefits, right? So receiving money to like go and purchase food. And like that is an issue that open source cannot quite solve. You need other people to build it. And that's where we see, these like small software developments popping up to fill this gap.
We have 2 minutes to answer the smashing corporations question now.
I mean, I think, first of all, it's all US dominated.
Yeah.
As far as I know, the net in a way is not open source, but it's basically US based. So, and that's one of the issues. So how can we get out of this US domination of the infrastructure to connect? So we would need, and again, we are depending on money because that would happen through the sky, through satellites and so on. Who is putting, again, satellites up there? It's Elon Musk and others, Starlink, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So infrastructure of connectivity somehow needs to become more accessible and social. Second part is data, is data collection, and I think there we can build a very alternative and parallel network of bringing data for the social good together. That, I think, is very, very doable because this is what we do on a very small scale and what others can do too. And we can bring that together.
To do it in 30 seconds. I think who owns technologies, basically, it depends a lot on IP laws, intellectual property laws, and how do R&D happens, because there's, like, as you said, a lot of funds, a lot of resources need to be put in until a product can be developed. That's why usually private entities have the most power and the most incentive to do it, because they have to go through that long development curve until they get the exponential growth of benefits. So it's a thing about IP laws, and if they have that intellectual property right, then they can use it to generate even more profit. And this is somehow a problem that it's of capitalism, maybe? I'm not sure. I'm not an expert of that. And on the other hand, solutions could be like to break the monopoly, like Digital Marketing Act, as I explained in the European context, or similar competition laws in the US or in the world that might help. And how do we cultivate a more open source solution? I think the problem is when I started to use Signal for like safer communication, none of my friends and my family are using it, so I'm basically alone and I'm antisocial at the point. Until WhatsApp has a huge privacy problem and Hong Kongers start to switch to Signal. Then I have friends and a social life again. I think it's very important how do you mobilize people to switch to alternative products, because we stay on the internet to get connected to people instead of being antisocial as I was at the very beginning to try to be safe. So it's very important how do we cultivate and educate people to switch for better options that we think it's better.
Thanks. I'm afraid that we're out of time for this session, but you'll all be around, right? So maybe there's some discussions in the break now. In 30 minutes on this stage, the program will continue with AI and media literacy. And in the meantime, I believe artworks and installations of Simon and Caroline will be shown. So stay here, engage in conversations, and thank you, Simon, Caroline, Kilian, and Glacier.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's Simon.
It's hinterher.
All right. The artwork itself is a so-called Decentralized Memorial, which means that I'm trying to place the file made, or all the documents made by the DDR police and the Stasi, who recorded basically all the escapes. It's a sheet of paper in a huge archive. And for me, my aim is with this project to take back those files, those documents, to the original place where it happened, where the people basically got shot by the soldiers or whatever happened when they tried to escape from East Germany.
So sah der aus, wenn ich schön Pullover hat angehabt. Durchschossene Hüfte bricht rechts Müller zusammen. Vor Schmerzen laut stöhnt ruft er um Hilfe. Als die Soldaten hinkommen, brüllt er sie an, ihr Schweinehunde.
Once we have these systems, these autonomous systems on the battleground, who is basically playing them the Zapfenstreich, right? And in that case, I create a machine who is playing a Zapfenstreich to symbolize other machines to retreat from the battleground. Google Maps Hex is an art performance I did in Berlin last year in 2020. And what I did was that I used 99 smartphones in a red wagon. I carried this wagon behind me in the streets of Berlin. And by doing so, I was able to generate a virtual traffic on Google Maps. And this had the effect that cars were being rerouted around me, and therefore, after a while, I definitely can say that the streets were getting more and more empty by cars. The whole journey about this project started when I thought about, like, what are digital maps these days and how they're going to be used, for example, in services like Tinder, for example, or like delivery services, for food service or for car sharing services. All those digital tools, they're using digital maps like the one from Google as their base layer. And that means that these maps, they have such an immense influence on that. And well, basically when we go back into the history of maps, then we can see that maps have been defined back in the days by states and the military. So they said, okay, or they defined, this is how a map should look like. And they also defined like how a border is drawn. And of course, they also used it as an argument to, for example, divide people or basically as an instrument of power. With the advance of Google Maps, there was some kind of paradigm change. The power of the owner of that map was shifted from the state or the military to a private company. And they now defining much more how it looks like on the one hand, but also in a sense of like what's the reality we're gonna see there. Of course, these maps, there are some algorithm running in the background, and there's machine learning involved in all of this. And for example, to detect virtual traffic, the way how those services or how Google Maps is working is that it detects a lot of smartphones on the street, and after a while, it will show you on Google Maps that there's a traffic in front of you. And this is like an algorithm which was trained with a lot of traffic data in the past, and then it can, in that sense, detect for the future, okay, will there be a lot of busy streets or not? And for the Google Maps hex performance, I use that algorithm, or basically this method, to trick the application to think that there is traffic, just by simply putting 99 smartphones into a wagon and carry it in the street of Berlin behind me. And after a while, the algorithm was thinking, okay, maybe there is a lot of stop-and-go behavior on that street, and by its pattern, which learned it in the past, it thought that there must be a traffic, and therefore the street was turned red. I think this performance or this hex shows quite well in a novel way how easy also we as individuals, as users of those tools, can with super simple things shape and also manipulate, in a way, hack back these systems. And I think that also opens a lot of potential for us, as we are more like this kind of people trying to think, okay, this is like a too big company, too big to fail and so on. And I think you can never say that there are such, let's say, secured or safe systems. There are always some kind of backdoors where we also can basically shape these tools as well. And it's also important to mention that we are not just using these tools, we are also part of it.
And so I had, I spent a lot of time with people who are working in this field of, programming, let's say, things for whatever banks and this kind of huge businesses, right? And the thing is, what I realize more and more is that those people, they are not really, questioning their own technology which they are using every day. aim or my goal is really like to questioning digital tools and to question technology and to raise awareness of what it means to use those kind of instruments. And what is also, to give basically much more like a not like an insight, but maybe like a glimpse or like a point of view, like what is actually this, what are these kind of hidden layers behind all of the services. Media art can somehow, tell this kind of stories and maybe also let people think about what they are using, let's say, there in their everyday life in talking about technology. And I think that's like for me, one of the big, let's say, potentials in this field.
Let me live. Let me live.
I'm Jake Elwes, and I'm a new media video artist.
The ZZ Project is about exploring the intersection between drag performance and queer identities, along with deepfake technology, and the ways in which art can help to demystify artificial intelligence.
Meine Damen und Herren, Mesdames and Messieurs, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone between and beyond the binary, welcome to the ZZ Show.
The ZZ Show is an interactive online deepfake cabaret where you can play with these deepfake drag artists that have been generated using artificial intelligence.
Through the magic and mystery of artificial intelligence, we will create a deep, fake, bespoke drag experience especially for you on our virtual stage.
As an artist, I'm so interested in when these systems break down. I think there's a lot of poetry in seeing these algorithms not do what they originally intended to do. And I thought this is a wonderful place to work with drag performers, because drag is about challenging society's notions around gender. So to use those performers to challenge these data sets highlights the fact that the people who have designed these systems and algorithms had a bias towards normativity.
Well, my dears, it's now over to you to make your first decisions of the show. It's quite simple, really. Pick a performer, then pick an act.
We made sure that we had a really good range of drag kings, drag queens, of different genders, different sexualities, and people from different parts of the London drag scene. And we created deep fake versions of each of those different performers.
Representation and consent were really important considerations for us in tackling how these technologies are currently being used to exploit people, such as with deepfake porn or fake news.
To construct a deepfake body, you initially film reference footage of someone moving around a room. You film them from every angle. This becomes your data set.
You then do what's called skeleton tracking. You turn the body into all of these different points.
The machine learning then comes in, and eventually it creates a version of that person that is almost indistinguishable from reality. You can then feed in any new skeleton doing any new movement, and it will create a synthesized version of that person doing that movement.
This is my love, and I don't give a damn for lost emotions. I touch a lot of love, but that's the gift. Let me live. Let me live.
I guess something for me that's always been really important in my work is to think about ways of demystifying artificial intelligence. there's so much fear that goes on, and that's often due to miscommunication around what we mean when we talk about AI. Deepfake is, in a way, an example of that, of our worst fears coming to life, that this machine is able to replace a human. That's not really the case. Right now, the issues are ethical and political and around policy and around power, and aren't so much around are computers going to replace the human brain.
The work deliberately plays with this false idea that AI systems are human-like. It constructs an AI character only to then deconstruct it, showing how it breaks down and making visible the technologies used in its construction.
Now, my darlings, AI systems often inherit the bias of the cis-white heteronormative patriarchy that controls our society. But here at the ZZ Show, we plan to disrupt the dataset by flooding it with a myriad of marvelous queer drag bodies.
These huge, vast datasets get created by these companies. If the people gathering that data have a bias towards white, Western faces, then the software that they're creating will do a really bad job at recognizing black people or trans people. The ZZ project is about tackling that bias. So thinking about how we can create our own data sets and take back the control. And as a queer community, thinking about whether we want to be recognized by these systems and can we queer these systems. So this idea of like dirtying the data set or queering the data set is something that I'm quite interested in. So we are creating a political piece of work, but it's light-hearted and it's fun at its core. It's silly, it's cabaret, it's an AI drag queen, but it does have this more serious dimension, which I hope that people will pick up when watching the piece.
Hello, my darlings. My name is Me, the Drag Queen, and I would like to welcome you to the gorgeous and historic Royal Vauxhall Tavern here in London. I am joined by artist Jake Elwes, and we are about to have a very fascinating conversation.
So yeah, we're going to be talking about the ZZ project. So it's the project I've been working on for the past few years, which is exploring the intersection of drag performance and artificial intelligence and deepfakes.
And what we're going to do is answer a bunch of viewer, audience, fan questions. So it's over to you for the first one of the night.
Where did the name ZZ come from?
Oh, shall I take this one?
Yeah, you do the boring bit of the name and I'll do the funny bit.
Okay. So the name ZZ came from a combination of the Z vector, which is how you control an interface with artificial intelligence, and the Z pronoun, which is gender neutral pronoun.
It's also the French for Willy.
What is it like seeing your resemblance perform in a style that isn't your own?
I think one of the most enjoyable things is actually kind of where you start seeing the similarities. Like, you know, when my sister Lily Snatchdragon, like, it's so clear that we've been working together for years and years and years and years. So it's nice to kind of see actually where these sort of things intersect, but then being controlled by Chio's body and his like incredible movement that he does as a king was sort of like mind-blowing, and it was just a whole like delightfully bizarre melting pot of stuff.
When will it speak?
Well, Siri and Alexa, right, it's gendered, and often we talk about the level of trust in relation to the gender which the AI assistant is. So yeah, we were looking into doing a gender neutral voice, which would be really fantastic. And actually there are some researchers working on this right now. I think there's Equal AI and Copenhagen Pride a few years ago created something called Q, which is an AI voice, but it's been trained on a data set of gender neutral and trans people.
AI systems often fail trans people. Discuss.
Discuss. It's not a question, just discuss it.
Yeah, it's very true. It does. Especially for facial recognition, when people are on hormones and their face shape is changing and their voice is changing, often these things fail to recognize them. And I guess as we're using these things more and more to like access our bank accounts and all sorts of things, like obviously that's quite dangerous if it fails to recognize you. But yeah, I guess there's always that question of whether you want to be recognized.
Can ZZ death drop?
Ooh. She struggles, like me, getting up and down off the floor. When Caramel provided movement for the ZZ show, she did a couple of dropping into the split moments and then a bit of floor routine. And then the AI generated people on top just kind of becoming these melted puddles on the floor. I think it really struggled as soon as the body started contorting out of the usual sort of like this into those strange floor-based positions. She couldn't cope with that, but it was enjoyable to watch. And like most drag acts, you know, getting down onto the floor isn't always pretty.
Would you kai with AI me?
I mean, I am a narcissist, so absolutely.
Why are you doing this?
He's terrible at painting. This is the only way to make art.
I think, yeah, that. I mean, I'm really interested in the process itself, in like showing the materiality of these algorithms, of these processes, like trying to expose how this stuff is working. Because like we're all talking about AI loads, we're all talking about deepfakes. Like people don't really understand what goes into making a deepfake and what artificial intelligence actually means. So I'm really excited to kind of use it. And I think in a way that was where it made so much sense to pair it with drag. So I guess that's why I'm doing it. I kind of want to change the narrative. I want to find a way of, celebrating communities rather than oppressing them with these technologies, which are quite dark and exploitative by nature.
What would you say to AI drag queens taking over the world?
Bring it on! Bring it on! We've not been doing so well ourselves, have we? Like, the human race have had a long fucking time to get their shit together, and they are not really doing so. So maybe it is time that drag queen AI took over and ruled us all.
I'm very much in the mindset that AI is not going to take over anytime soon, and actually the most interesting things happen when it's humans collaborating with these super sterile mathematical counting machines, and the creativity and the quirkiness and queerness of a drag performer kind of paired with these cool technologies makes something really interesting. We do all have this idea of like the Terminator, so yeah, I'd probably argue that it's not going to take over. Yeah.
Why drag?
I mean, it's my job, so that's kind of what I'm here for. I just think, we want to inject the fun, the spirit, the community.
Yeah, for me, it's like drag because drag is fun and celebratory and playful and can be camp and silly and all of those things and kind of take it into a completely different direction. But also drag, for me, is often about challenging ideas and notions around gender and around normativity, and that is something that is generally lacking or completely overlooked by people building these systems. So
that's why.